The water is dark and it is rippling, the way water in a working harbour always moves, not the open movement of a river or the directional movement of a tide coming fully in or fully out, but the contained, complicated movement of water in an enclosed basin that receives pressure from multiple directions simultaneously and resolves that pressure into a surface that shifts and catches what light there is without quite settling. The sun seems slow to rise this morning. The sky above the dock has begun the transition from full darkness toward the particular dark grey that precedes dawn in a city whose atmosphere already carries the accumulated smoke of the previous day's industrial operations, and the quality of that transition is different from the clear pre-dawn sky you might find above open country. It is a gradual reduction of darkness rather than a movement toward genuine brightness, and it arrives at the waterfront slightly later than it arrives at the rooftops of the surrounding city, because the buildings and the warehouses and the tall masts of the ships waiting at the quays create a local geography that holds the darkness down at water level a little longer than the open sky above releases it. The ships are already in place. They did not arrive this morning. Most of them have been at their berths through the night, waiting for the working day to begin, their hulls dark against the slightly less dark water, their rigging visible as a web of lines and spars against the sky where the masts extend high enough to catch the first faint differentiation between the ship and the atmosphere above it. Some of them have come considerable distances to reach this berth, across the Atlantic from ports on the American eastern seaboard carrying bales of cotton bound for the Lancashire mills, from the Baltic carrying timber for the construction industry's insatiable demand, from the Mediterranean carrying oil and dye and goods whose ultimate destination is somewhere in the inland industrial system that the port serves as its primary point of entry. The ships are waiting for the labour that will empty them. Along the perimeter fence of the dock estate, at the hiring gates where the foreman will appear within the hour to select the day's working gangs, the first groups of men are already gathering. They have come from the surrounding streets, from the lodging houses and the cramped terraces of the dock districts, from the areas closest to the water where housing was cheapest, and proximity to the hiring gates most valuable, given that casual dock labour required physical presence at the right place at the right time without any guarantee of employment. They stand in the particular posture of men who know that they may or may not work today, that the number of jobs available depends on factors: how many ships have arrived, what cargo they carry, how quickly it needs to be cleared, and the foreman's own preferences and prior acquaintances, over which they have no control whatsoever. The port does not feel quiet even now, before the formal working day has properly established itself. Lines creak against cleats. A winch somewhere on the far side of the basin runs briefly and stops. A cart horse in the nearby yard shifts its weight and the harness jingles. Men at the hiring fence talk in low voices that carry across the water without their meaning being clear from any distance. The administrative offices of the dock estate are beginning to show light in their windows. The port's working day, in the industrial Britain of the mid-19th century, does not begin at a single definitive moment. It begins in stages, accumulating from these pre-dawn preparations, through the opening of the hiring gates, through the selection and deployment of the day's labour gangs, through the first gangplanks being run out to the waiting vessels, until by the time the surrounding city has properly awakened, the port has already been in operation for hours, and the first cargo of the day is already moving from ship to quayside. The dock before sunrise belongs to the people who have to be there early to work and support their families. It will belong to many more people shortly, but at this hour, in this particular darkness, it is a place of waiting and water and the ships that arrived in the night with their holds still full. If you haven't already, subscribe to the archive and leave a comment below. Ring the bell so that you won't miss more boring everyday life historical studies as only the archive can bring it. Settle in The hiring gates are about to open and the day is about to begin in the particular way that a working port in Victorian Britain begins. The mills, foundries and factories whose operations this series has documented in various forms across its previous episodes share a dependency that is easy to overlook when the focus is on what happens inside them. They cannot produce without raw materials, and the raw materials they require in the quantities that industrial scale production demands cannot, in most cases, be sourced from anywhere within Britain's own geography in sufficient volume to meet that demand. The cotton that feeds the Lancashire spinning mills, examined in earlier parts of this series, does not come from anywhere in England. It comes from the American South, from Egypt, from India. Agricultural regions whose specific climatic and soil conditions produce the cotton fibre that industrial textile production requires, and whose own economic relationships with Britain's industrial system involve dynamics that extend well beyond the simple transaction of shipping cargo across an ocean. The timber that the construction industry consumes in the enormous quantities that industrial city expansion demands comes primarily from the Baltic and from North America, where forests of a scale that Britain's own timber resources had long since ceased to offer still provided the material that building and shipbuilding and 100 other industries required continuously. A factory whose raw material supply is interrupted is a factory that cannot operate, and the consequences of that interruption travel quickly through the industrial system. A Lancashire mill that does not receive its cotton shipment because weather delayed the vessel carrying it, or because a dispute at the port held the cargo in customs longer than anticipated, or because the transport connection between the port and the mill district failed for any of the reasons that mid-19th century transport connections could fail. That mill loses production days that it cannot recover. Its workers lose wages they were counting on, and its customers receive their orders late or not at all. The dependency is real and it runs in both directions. The port depends on industrial demand to generate the cargo volumes that sustain its own operations, and the industrial interior depends on the port to deliver the materials that keep its machinery running. The expansion of Britain's port capacity during this period is inseparable from the expansion of Britain's industrial production capacity, and both are inseparable from the expansion of Britain's commercial relationships with the rest of the world. As the factories grew larger, more numerous and more productive, they required more raw material, which required more cargo capacity, which required larger ships, deeper docks, more extensive warehouse infrastructure, more efficient cargo handling, and a larger and more specialised labour force to keep all of it moving. The port cities, London, Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, Hull, and the others whose quays received the material that British industry consumed and distributed the goods that British industry produced, grew in direct proportion to the industrial system they served, their own expansion, a reflection of the industrial expansion occurring in the inland cities that their waterways and road and rail connections linked to the global trade routes that ships brought to their doorsteps. A single ship arriving at a British port in the 1840s with a full cargo of raw cotton represents, in its hold, a quantity of material that might sustain several days of production at the mills that will eventually receive it. The delay of that ship by a week, by weather, by port congestion, by any of the operational complications that commercial shipping routinely encountered, is felt not at the waterfront where the ship eventually docks, but in the mill towns hundreds of miles inland where the looms stand waiting. The port is the entrance to the industrial system. Everything the system consumes from beyond Britain's shores must pass through it, and the efficiency or inefficiency of what happens at the waterfront travels inland with the cargo. A ship arriving at a major Victorian port does not simply sail in and moor wherever space is available. It enters a managed system whose complexity is invisible from the outside, but immediately apparent to anyone with operational responsibility for any part of it. The approach to a major port involves navigating water that is shared simultaneously by incoming vessels, outgoing vessels, river traffic of various kinds, and the small working craft, the lighters, the tugs, the pilot boats that serve the port's internal operations. Collision in a congested waterway is a serious risk with serious consequences, and the management of that risk requires a set of established conventions and formal controls that govern how vessels move through shared water. Signal systems communicate information between shore stations and approaching ships about the state of the harbour, the availability of berths, and the directions that incoming vessels should follow through the approaches toward their assigned destination within the dock estate. The harbour pilot is the specialised professional who manages the most critical phase of this transition. Boarding an incoming vessel from a small pilot boat in the approaches to the harbour, the pilot takes temporary navigational authority over the ship for the passage through the port's confined and congested waters, applying a local knowledge of channels, tides, turning points, and hazards that no visiting captain, however experienced in the open sea, can be assumed to possess. The pilot's authority during this period is absolute within its defined scope. The ship's captain defers to the pilot's navigation decisions for the duration of the passage through the harbour approaches, the pilot's local expertise taking precedence over the captain's general command authority for this specific and critical purpose. Tides govern the timing of a ship's entry in ways that no commercial schedule can entirely override. A vessel drawing more than a certain depth of water cannot enter the enclosed dock basins of many major Victorian ports until the tide provides sufficient water depth over the entrance sills to clear the vessel's keel. This means that the practical arrival time of any given ship, the moment at which it can actually be brought to its assigned berth and unloading can begin, is determined in part by the tide table rather than by the commercial schedule under which the ship has been operating, and tide tables are determined by astronomical forces that industrial scheduling cannot influence. The tension between the regularity that commercial operations demand and the astronomical regularity that tides provide, but on their own schedule, is a permanent feature of port operations that no amount of engineering or administrative ingenuity has ever fully resolved. Once a vessel is in its berth, the ship's transition from a moving object traversing open water to a stationary object within a managed system is complete, and a new set of operational requirements immediately takes over. Dock officials confirm the vessel's identity and its expected cargo against the manifests that should have preceded it through official channels. Customs officers board to begin the inspection and documentation process that the port's revenue function requires. Labour gangs assigned from the day's workforce are directed to the berth to begin the physical process of accessing and unloading the cargo. The vessel that was, an hour ago, an independent object moving through open water under its own navigational authority is now one component of a much larger and much more complex stationary operation. Its further movement, whether onward to another port, back to its origin, or to a different berth within the same dock estate, dependent on the completion of processes that are not entirely within its own or its owner's control. The gangplank is a narrow space to carry a heavy load across, and the men who do it have learned this through daily repetition rather than through any formal training that acknowledge the difficulty involved. The unloading of a Victorian cargo vessel is, at its operational core, a problem of moving heavy objects through a sequence of awkward transitions, from the ship's hold to the ship's deck, from the ship's deck across the gangplank to the quayside, from the quayside into the cart or the warehouse or the temporary storage area that has been designated for this particular cargo. Each of these transitions involves a change of surface, a change of height, a change of the conditions under which a heavy object must be controlled by the people carrying it, and the combination of these transitions across a full working day represents a physical demand that the body accumulates without any single moment being dramatic enough to appear remarkable from the outside. Sacks of grain, each one containing 100 or more pounds of material, are loaded onto a worker's back in the ship's hold and carried up a ladder to the deck across the gangplank, which moves under the weight and the motion of the water below, and onto the quayside, where they are either loaded directly onto a waiting cart or stacked temporarily in the sequence the warehouse will receive them. Barrels of oil or sugar are rolled from their position in the hold to the hatch opening, lifted or hoisted to the deck level, and then rolled along the quayside surface to their destination. Timber is carried in bundles or swung in loads using the hoisting equipment where available, but the final placement of each piece in the stack requires hands and positioning judgment that no mechanical device in this period provides automatically. Speed has a commercial logic attached to it that bears directly on the workers performing the labor. A ship occupying a berth is generating costs. The berth fee, the costs of the vessel and crew during the time at anchor, that its owners are motivated to minimize by clearing the cargo as quickly as possible and getting the vessel back to sea. This commercial pressure translates into an expectation of pace on the unloading gang that is not always compatible with the pace at which heavy physical labor can be sustained safely over a full working day. A gang that works quickly in the morning, driven by the commercial pressure to clear the hold efficiently, will work differently in the afternoon than in the morning, and the afternoon's different pace carries its own risks in an environment where the physical consequences of a lapse in attention or judgment are immediate and sometimes serious. Injury in dock work during this period was sufficiently common to be treated as an ordinary occupational risk rather than as an exceptional event. Crushed fingers and hands from cargo shifting during handling, falls from gangplanks or from the ship's deck to the hold or to the quayside below, strains and ruptures from sustained heavy lifting. These were the injuries that dock work generated with a regularity that the workers themselves understood and accommodated within their understanding of what the work involved. There was no formal injury compensation available to a casual dock worker in mid-19th century Britain whose injury prevented him from working. The income that would have been earned on the days the injury prevented work simply was not earned, and the consequence of that income loss fell entirely on the injured worker and whatever domestic arrangements depended on his wages. The gangplank continued to be crossed, loaded hundreds of times each day. Human exhaustion was an accepted cost of keeping the cargo in motion. The crane, standing at the edge of the quay, extends the reach of the labor force in a specific and valuable direction, upward, that unaided human bodies cannot efficiently serve for loads beyond a certain weight. Victorian dockside cranes in the major ports of the mid-19th century varied considerably in their design, their power source, and their lifting capacity depending on the age of the installation and the specific cargo handling requirements of the berth they served. The older fixed cranes, operating through manual labor applied to a capstan or a wheel, translated the rotary effort of several workers into the lifting of a load through a system of ropes and pulleys that provided mechanical advantage without any source of power beyond the workers themselves. Steam-powered cranes, increasingly common in the better-equipped ports of the 1840s and 1850s, applied the same steam technology that was transforming inland manufacturing to the specific problem of lifting heavy cargo from ship to quayside, achieving lifting capacities and operating speeds that manual cranes could not match. The block and tackle systems that supplemented or replaced cranes at many berths operated on the same mechanical advantage principle. A system of pulleys that reduced the force required to lift a given load at the cost of requiring that force to be applied through a greater distance. A load that would require 6 men to lift directly could be raised by 2 men applying their effort through a 3-purchase block and tackle system, which made the system invaluable for loads that exceeded any practical direct lifting capacity but could still be controlled by a small team with the appropriate equipment. The introduction of mechanical lifting equipment into the dock environment did not reduce the human labor requirements of cargo handling in the simple way that the introduction of steam machinery had reduced certain hand labor requirements in manufacturing. What it did was change the nature of some of that labor while leaving the total demand for human presence and human judgment on the quayside largely unchanged. The crane lifted the load, but someone had to attach the lifting hook to the cargo in the ship's hold, which required a worker to descend into the hold and maneuver the hook into position under or around items that were often tightly packed and irregularly shaped. Someone had to guide the suspended load as it rose from the hold and swung across to the quayside, preventing it from spinning or catching on the ship's structure during the transit, which required a worker on deck with a steadying line and the judgment to apply tension at the right moments. Someone had to receive the load on the quayside and direct it to its correct resting position, detaching the hook and clearing the equipment for the next lift. These roles required continuous attention and a specific kind of physical and spatial awareness, the ability to track a moving heavy load in 3 dimensions, while remaining aware of the positions of other workers, other loads, and the structural elements of the ship and the crane in the immediate vicinity. A suspended load that began to swing unexpectedly could kill or seriously injure anyone in its path before any of the workers involved could react, and the potential for unexpected movement was a permanent feature of the lifting operation given the variability of wind, the motion of the water, and the irregularity of cargo shapes and weights. The crane extended human strength without removing human vulnerability. The load that one man could not lift was now reachable, but the load that could fall on one man was now also considerably heavier and considerably faster. Step back from the quayside into the long shadow of the warehouse that runs behind it, and the scale of what the port actually contains becomes apparent in a different way. The warehouse is not a temporary structure. It is a substantial building, brick-built, several stories high, with loading doors at each floor level that allow cargo to be hoisted directly from the quayside into the appropriate storage tier without the material having to be carried through the interior stairways. These buildings were constructed to hold quantities of goods that the trade volumes of a major Victorian port generated continuously, and they were built with the expectation that they would be in use for decades rather than seasons, their architecture reflecting the industrial system's confidence in its own continued expansion. Inside, the organization of goods follows the administrative logic of the port rather than any natural arrangement. Cotton bales from different shipments and different consignees are stored in designated areas that reflect their ownership and their customs status, rather than their physical similarity or their eventual destination. Barrels of sugar are arranged in rows that reflect the warehouse's internal accounting system. Who owns what quantity, in which rows, under what customs bond, awaiting what clearance before they can be moved forward. Timber is stacked in the yard areas adjacent to the main building where its bulk and its fire risk make interior storage impractical. Sacks of grain occupy the upper floors, where the floor loadings are calculated to support their combined weight across the area they occupy. The goods stored here originated in places whose specific geography, labor conditions, and natural resources are entirely invisible from inside the warehouse. A bale of American cotton in a Liverpool warehouse does not carry with it any direct information about the plantation system that produced it, the agricultural labor that grew and harvested it, the pressing and baling operation that prepared it for shipping, or the transatlantic passage that brought it to this building. It is, from the warehouse's administrative perspective, simply an item with a specific weight, a specific customs classification, a specific consignee, and a specific destination once cleared. The human and environmental complexity of its production and transit has been abstracted into inventory data by the time it reaches this shelf. The same is true of the timber from the Baltic and the sugar from the Caribbean and the grain from the Black Sea region. Each commodity arrives at the warehouse stripped of the specific human circumstances of its production, the labor, the land, the economic relationships that determined who grew or harvested or extracted it and under what conditions, and reconstituted as tradable property with commercial characteristics defined by weight, quality, and market price. The warehouse is where this transformation from produced thing to tradable property is physically completed and administratively confirmed, and the clerks who move through it with their ledgers and their measuring instruments are the agents of that transformation, recording and confirming the commercial identity of goods whose production history the warehouse does not require and does not preserve. Long rows of barrels and bales and crates in a Victorian dockside warehouse are, in this sense, the physical form taken by a global trading system at the point of maximum abstraction, the moment between the labour that created the goods and the consumption or further industrial processing that will eventually use them. Global trade becomes visible here as stacked property, organized not by origin or story, but by ownership, clearance status, and floor space. The cargo that the dock worker has unloaded from the ship and the warehouse worker has received and stored does not move forward in the commercial system until a different category of worker has applied a different category of labor to it. The customs officer, the weigher, the clerk, the inspector. These figures move through the dock environment with instruments and ledgers rather than hooks and sacks, and the labour they perform is the administrative labour without which the physical labour of unloading and storage would produce nothing commercially useful. A bale of cotton sitting in a warehouse is commercially inert until its existence has been officially confirmed, its weight recorded against the shipping manifest, its customs classification established, its duty calculated and either paid or secured through the appropriate bond, and the documentation authorizing its release to the consignee has been signed by the relevant official and filed in the appropriate register. The customs duty system that the Victorian port administered was the primary mechanism through which the British government collected revenue from international trade, and the revenue it generated was substantial. A major port in the mid-19th century was, among its other functions, a major tax collection operation, and the efficiency with which it performed that collection function was a significant governmental concern in addition to its commercial and logistical significance. The customs establishment employed a large staff of officers, clerks, and administrators whose specific responsibility was ensuring that the revenue due on imported goods was correctly calculated and collected before those goods were permitted to enter the domestic market. The paperwork generated by a single ship's cargo arrival could be considerable. The cargo manifest, prepared by the ship's master and submitted to customs on arrival, listed every item in the hold with its description, quantity, weight, and declared value. The customs officers checked this manifest against what was actually in the hold, a process that could involve physical inspection and measurement of individual items where the declared details were questionable or where the category of goods was one associated with smuggling or undervaluation. The weigher recorded the actual weight of goods on the official scales, which determined the duty payable on weight-rated categories. The clearance documentation authorized the movement of each consignment from customs control into the consignee's possession, and this document, once issued, was what allowed the physical goods to leave the warehouse and begin the next stage of their journey toward the factories or the markets that had ordered them. A consignment held in customs, awaiting documentation, awaiting payment of duty, awaiting resolution of a query about the manifest, was a consignment that was not moving, and goods that were not moving were generating storage costs and delaying the industrial processes that depended on their arrival. Commerce depended as much on this documentation system functioning efficiently as on the physical labor of unloading and storage. The quill moving across a ledger page in a customs office was as essential to the port's function as the hook descending into a ship's hold, and the clerk who could process clearance documentation quickly and accurately was as operationally valuable as the gang foreman who could direct labor efficiently. The port's physical and administrative systems were not separate operations. They were different components of the same machine, and the machine required both to function. The moment a cleared consignment leaves the warehouse and enters the transport network that will carry it to its ultimate destination is the moment the port's direct involvement in that specific cargo ends and the industrial interior's involvement begins. The means by which cleared cargo left the major Victorian ports and reached the industrial cities and manufacturing districts that had ordered it changed considerably over the period this series has been examining. The change tracking the development of the transport infrastructure that Episode 7 addressed in detail. In the earlier decades of this period, the primary means of moving bulk cargo from port to destination was water. River barges using navigable rivers, canal boats using the inland waterway network that earlier industrial investment had constructed, and in some ports direct coastal shipping that moved goods between ports before they were transferred to inland transport. These water-based routes were slow, but they were capable of handling the heavy, bulky cargoes that manufacturing required in large quantities and that road transport could not move economically at scale. The railway's arrival changed the economics and the speed of this distribution fundamentally. A rail connection between a major port and an inland manufacturing district compressed the transit time for raw materials from days to hours, allowing mills and foundries to plan their production schedules around more reliable and faster delivery than the previous transport infrastructure had permitted. Raw cotton arriving at Liverpool on a Monday could be at a Manchester warehouse by Tuesday under rail conditions that would have required the better part of a week by canal. The practical consequence was not simply faster delivery but tighter planning. The ability to operate with smaller buffer stocks of raw material because the replenishment cycle was shorter and more reliable, which reduced the capital tied up in standing inventory and allowed more of the firm's resources to be deployed in active production. The cart remained essential for the final stage of distribution within the urban areas that rail connections could not reach directly, and the dock areas themselves depended heavily on horse-drawn vehicles for the movement of goods between the quayside, the warehouses, and the railway goods yards where cargo was transferred to rail wagons for the inland journey. A busy dock street in a major Victorian port during working hours was a complex and sometimes hazardous environment of competing traffic. Heavy carts carrying outbound cargo, lighter vehicles delivering supplies to the ships in berth, porters and hand trucks moving smaller consignments, dock workers crossing between work locations, and the occasional supervised movement of livestock that formed part of the agricultural imports that port cities also handled alongside the industrial raw materials. The unloading of a single ship in this broader context was not a self-contained event. It was the first movement in a sequence that would continue through warehouse storage, through customs clearance, through loading onto rail wagons or canal boats or road carts, through the transit to the inland destination, through the receiving and storage operations at the factory or the merchant's warehouse, until the material finally entered the production process that had generated the original order. The ship's arrival at the berth and the gang's work to empty its hold began dozens of other processes in dozens of other locations, involving dozens of other categories of labor, none of which could proceed until the first had been completed. The men who gathered at the hiring gate before sunrise this morning may or may not be working at this point in the day. The casual hiring system that governed dock labor in Victorian Britain produced for the employer a flexible workforce that could be expanded or contracted in direct response to the actual volume of shipping arriving on any given day without the employer carrying any fixed labor cost on days when ships were not arriving. For the worker, it produced an existence organized around the daily uncertainty of whether income would be earned, in what quantity and for how many hours, with no mechanism to smooth that uncertainty across days when it resolved favorably and days when it did not. The hiring process itself, conducted at the gates of the dock estate at the beginning of each working day, and sometimes at intervals through the day as additional ships arrived or additional labor requirements emerged, was a scene of considerable human intensity that contemporaries who described it captured with a consistent emphasis on the press of men competing for a limited number of positions. A foreman emerging from the dock office to select a gang for a specific ship or a specific task had, standing before him, more men than he needed, and his selection of specific individuals over others was made on the basis of prior acquaintance, observed reliability, physical appearance, suggesting capacity for the required labor, and whatever other considerations the foreman applied, not all of which were purely professional in character. A worker unknown to the foreman, or known unfavorably, or visibly injured or unwell, or simply standing in the wrong part of the crowd at the moment the selection was made, might spend the morning waiting without being selected, eventually accepting that today's income would not arrive and turning back toward home or toward whatever alternative the remainder of the day offered. Employment depended on factors well beyond the worker's control or influence. The pattern of ship arrivals at any given port was determined by winds, by the sailing schedules of distant shipping companies, by the condition of weather in the sea routes the ships had traveled, and by the commercial decisions of merchants and shippers whose awareness of the dock workers' situation and whose consideration for it were minimal. A week of favorable shipping arrivals producing full employment for the labor force could be followed by a week of poor weather in the approaches that kept ships waiting outside the harbor, producing very little work for the same labor force, with no formal mechanism to distribute the income earned during the good week across the bad one. The port appeared prosperous in the way that busy, expanding commercial operations appear prosperous when viewed from the outside. The ships, the warehouses, the trade volumes, the evident movement of valuable goods through an efficient system. The labor that sustained this prosperity operated beneath the visible surface of that prosperity in conditions whose instability the prosperity's appearance did not reflect and whose costs the prosperity's beneficiaries did not bear. The sun has set some time ago and the dock is still working. This is not an exception tonight. It is the ordinary condition of a major commercial port operating at the scale that mid-19th century British trade required of it. A scale at which the working day's end does not empty the quayside because the commercial pressure to clear cargo quickly enough to release berths for the next arrivals does not recognize the working day's end as a meaningful boundary. Ships arrive when they arrive, determined by wind and tide and voyage duration rather than by the preferences of the workers waiting to unload them. And a ship that arrives at 10 in the evening and carries a perishable cargo, or a cargo whose consignee requires it for production processes that cannot wait, or a cargo whose berth must be cleared by the following morning for the next arrival. That ship requires a night gang, and the night gang is assembled from among the workers available to take the work, and the work proceeds under lamplight with the same basic operations that the day gang performed under daylight. The lamplight is different from daylight in ways that matter for the specific physical tasks of unloading. The shadow it creates is more directional and deeper than daylight's shadow, which means that the spatial judgment required for guiding suspended loads and positioning cargo on the quayside is performed with less visual information than the daytime version of the same task provides. Workers who have spent years developing the practical spatial awareness that dock work requires carry that awareness into the night shift, but carry it into a sensory environment that makes its application somewhat more demanding than the daytime version. One gang replaces another as the shift system distributes the continuous operation of the port across the hours of the day and night. The worker who has spent 12 hours on the quayside goes home, through the dark dock streets, past the hiring gates that will open again in a few hours toward whatever domestic arrangement awaits, and the worker who replaces him picks up the same operation at whatever point it has reached, continuing the same loading or unloading sequence with the same basic tools and the same basic labor. The cargo does not know that a different person is now handling it. The system does not register the transition. The work continues. The port is, in this final observation, the fullest expression of the industrial system this entire series has been documenting. The system in which continuous production, continuous movement, and continuous labor are the operational standard, and the human needs of the individuals performing that labor are accommodated only insofar as accommodation is consistent with the continuity the system requires. The factory bell, the mill overseer's walkway, the workhouse bell, the railway timetable, these were all instruments of the same underlying logic, applied in different institutional settings to different populations of workers for different specific purposes. The port's organizing instrument is the tide and the ship's arrival, which is to say the organizing instrument is commercial necessity expressed through natural forces, and it produces the same result that the factory's bell and the workhouse's schedule produced. Continuous operation sustained by human bodies that the system requires to be present and functional at the times the operation demands, regardless of those bodies' own rhythms and requirements. Goods move through this system faster than most workers handling them can understand their origin or their destination. The cotton bale that arrives from the American South passes through the dock worker's hands on its way to the mill, and through the mill worker's hands on its way to becoming cloth, and through the merchant's hands on its way to market, and none of these workers has a comprehensive view of the full chain they are participating in. They each see their own section of it, the hold, the quayside, the spinning frame, the warehouse, and perform their section's requirements without the wider system becoming visible to them as a whole. The port is industrial Britain's connection to the world that supplies it and the world that buys from it. The ships that bring the raw material and carry away the finished goods are the physical mechanism of that connection, and the labor that moves the cargo between the ship and the industrial interior is the labor that keeps the mechanism operational. It is exhausted labor, insecure labor, physically demanding labor performed in conditions that the system's commercial logic has never required to be comfortable. And it continues through the night under the lamps, one gang replacing another, the same motions repeated, the same quayside receiving the same kinds of loads from different ships, the water dark below the dock edge, and the cranes standing still in the intervals between lifts, waiting for the next load to be attached. The port that never sleeps also does not sleep tonight. The last gang has gone, and the quayside has quieted to the sounds it keeps for itself. Water against the hull, a rope's slow creak, the distant machinery of whatever operation is still running in the far basin. You remain for a moment at the edge of the dock, the lamp behind you throwing your shadow across the dark water below. The ships are still in. The tide is swaying as always. Tomorrow the gates will open again before the sun appears in the sky. These are the systems that moved the world's goods through exhausted hands, organized around the ship's schedule, the tide's permission, and the foreman's choice, and never quite finished. If you'd like to join us again, the archive is always open.